At 7:42 a.m. on the 6th of March 1944, Colonel Donald James Blakeslee sat strapped into the narrow cockpit of his P-51 Mustang at Debden Airfield in eastern England. The field was still cloaked in grey morning haze, the grass slick with dew, the sound of engines warming filling the cold air. Around him, ground crews moved quickly along the rows of silver fighters, checking oil lines, tightening cowlings, arming machine guns, and securing the new paper-skinned drop tanks that hung beneath each wing. The smell of high-octane fuel, oil, and exhaust mixed with the chill of the English spring. Blakeslee adjusted his oxygen mask, looked once more across the flight line, and waited for the signal to start the most ambitious mission the U.S. 8th Air Force had ever attempted, an escorted daylight raid on Berlin, the heart of Hitler's empire. For nearly 5 years of war, Berlin had remained the unreachable fortress of the Third Reich. German intelligence officers had repeatedly assured their superiors that no Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach the city and return. They had studied captured American aircraft, calculated fuel consumption, and concluded that even the best of them, P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings, would run dry hundreds of miles short of the capital. To the Luftwaffe, Berlin lay far beyond the reach of any US planned fighter. Its skies could only be challenged by high-flying bombers forced to go naked, unescorted, vulnerable targets for the defenders of the Reich. That morning, Blakeslee's Mustangs were about to prove every one of those assumptions wrong. Each of his aircraft carried a new and almost unbelievable load of fuel. Under the thin aluminum wings hung two 108-gallon external tanks, lightweight and disposable, made from laminated paper and glue, an ingenious wartime improvisation manufactured in Britain. Filled with aviation gasoline, those tanks would extend the Mustang's range farther than any fighter before it. Combined with the internal wing tanks and an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat, the P-51 could now fly more than 850 miles in combat radius, enough to cross the North Sea, sweep over northern Germany, protect the bombers all the way to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes if necessary, and still have the fuel to come home. The Luftwaffe's high command had declared such a feat impossible. Their engineers' calculations said the Americans lacked both the fuel capacity and the engine efficiency for such range. Their pilots had been briefed that they would never see Allied fighters over the capital. German squadrons were instructed to wait beyond known escort range, then tear into the exposed bomber formations as soon as the fighters turned back west. For 2 years, this tactic had worked brutally well. Blakeslee, however, knew the cost of that imbalance better than anyone. At 26 years old, he was already a legend among fighter pilots. He had begun his combat career long before America entered the war, flying with the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron's units of American volunteers who joined the fight through Britain's service in 1941. Later, when the United States Army Air Forces arrived in Europe, he transferred to the 4th Fighter Group, becoming one of its most respected leaders. By 1944, he had logged over 500 combat missions, more than any other American pilot in the theater. He had seen bombers go down in flames, watched crews bail out over enemy territory, and felt the helpless frustration of turning home because his fuel gauges demanded it, while the bombers flew on alone toward their deaths. That morning at Debden, he was determined that it would never happen again. Inside the Mustang's cockpit, the instruments gleamed faintly in the thin dawn light. The manifold, pressure gauge, the fuel selector switches, the twin magnetos. He tapped the face of the fuel gauge on the fuselage tank full. The new Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine rumbled as he advanced the throttle slightly, the propeller spinning into a blur. Around him, the flight line came alive. The roar of dozens of Merlins blended into a single thunder that rolled across the countryside, scattering flocks of birds into the grey sky. The mission plan was simple but audacious. More than 800 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would head east across the North Sea, through the Netherlands, and deep into Germany. Their target was Berlin's industrial and rail infrastructure, the very center of the Nazi war machine. The bombers would be joined and protected the entire way by nearly 900 fighters. The 4th Fighter Group, under Blakeslee's command, would provide high cover over the bombers, maintaining altitude between 28,000 and 30,000 feet, intercepting German attackers before they could reach the slow-moving bomber boxes. For the first time, no American bomber would fly unescorted all the way to and from Berlin. Blakeslee's hand-picked squadrons, 48 Mustangs in all, taxied one by one onto the long concrete runway. Each pilot carried enough ammunition for his 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, enough oxygen for 7 hours of flight, and enough courage to face the most formidable air defense network in the world. The weather officers predicted scattered clouds over Germany, with visibility of 3 to 5 miles, good bombing weather, but also perfect for interceptors. Every man on that flight line knew that hundreds of German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf Fof 190 seconds, would be climbing to meet them. The takeoff order came over the radio. Blakeslee rolled forward, carefully feeding power into the engine. At full throttle, the torque from the massive propeller threatened to pull the Mustang off the runway, but he held it steady, feeling the wheels lift at 120 miles per hour. The plane clawed into the sky, heavy with fuel and ammunition, and he began a slow climbing turn over the airfield, watching as his squadrons joined formation below him, rows of gleaming fighters catching the first rays of the rising Sunday. The English countryside fell away behind them. Ahead lay the grey expanse of the North Sea. At 8 a.m., the Mustangs levelled at 10,000 feet and headed east. Over the radio came the clipped voices of flight leaders confirming positions, fuel readings, and climb schedules. Every few minutes, Blakeslee reminded his pilots to monitor their fuel transfer burn from the fuselage tank, first to keep the aircraft's center of gravity forward. One mistake could make the plane dangerously unstable in combat. 2.5 hours later, the bombers and escorts reached the Dutch coast. Below, windmills and fields slid past in orderly patterns. Ahead, Germany waited. As the formations crossed the border, the first distant contrails of enemy aircraft appeared at high altitude. German radar stations had already picked up the incoming force and scrambled nearly every available fighter. From airfields around Hanover, Bremen, and Magdeburg, hundreds of 109 seconds and 190 seconds climbed to intercept. Blakeslee's calm voice broke over the radio. Bogies, 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. More forming 1 o'clock level. Looks like 50. The sky ahead began to fill with tiny glints of sunlight, the enemy coming to meet them. For years, these same German pilots had waited just beyond escort range, confident that the Americans would soon turn back and leave the bombers defenseless. But today, as they approached, something was different. The Mustangs were not breaking off. Instead, they turned toward the oncoming Germans, climbing to meet them head-on. At 9:58 a.m., the first attack began. The air over northern Germany erupted into twisting trails of smoke and gunfire as the two formations collided. For 7 furious minutes, the sky was filled with the crack of machine guns and the flash of cannon shells. Blakeslee's guns jammed after a brief burst, but he stayed in the fight, maneuvering aggressively to protect his squadron. His wingmen destroyed several enemy aircraft. The Germans, expecting an easy run on the bombers, found themselves locked in combat with a fighter that could turn, climb, and dive as well as theirs, and that had arrived from England, an impossibility, according to their intelligence. When the last German broke off and dived for the clouds, the American formation was still intact. Not one bomber in Blakeslee's assigned group had been lost. By the time the P-51 seconds reached Berlin, the bombers had already begun their bomb runs. From 30,000 feet, Blakeslee looked down through thin haze and saw the dark lines of streets, the winding Spree River, and the flashes of flak bursting among the formations. He could see the heavy smoke of explosions rising from the city below Berlin was burning. Hours later, after escorting the bombers safely back across the Netherlands and the North Sea, Blakeslee touched down at Debden with only 20 gallons of fuel left, barely 10 minutes of flight time. Every one of his aircraft returned. The mission had taken 6 hours and 40 minutes. Not a single bomber under the 4th Fighter Group's protection had been shot down by enemy fighters. Unbeknownst to the Americans, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had watched the contrails from his headquarters in Berlin that day. He had been assured repeatedly that such an attack was impossible, that no American fighter could escort bombers to the capital. When he saw the P-51 seconds glinting in the sunlight above Berlin, he is said to have turned to his aides and admitted, quietly but unmistakably, "The war is lost." That morning, the impossible became reality. The long-range Mustang had arrived over Berlin, and with it came the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's dominance in the European sky. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Europe was teetering on the edge of failure. The vision had been bold: to destroy Germany's war-making capacity through precision bombing in daylight, striking its factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and industrial centers with unrelenting force. But the reality was bloodier than anyone had predicted. Every mission that reached deep into German territory came at a staggering cost in aircraft and men. The problem was simple but deadly. The bombers could reach the targets, but the fighters could not. From their airfields in England, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the US. 8th Air Force could fly over 1,000 miles round trip, enough to hit almost any industrial target in the Reich. But their escorts, the sleek, fast American fighters designed to protect them, were all limited by range. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's mainstay fighter in 1943, was an impressive machine, heavily armed, nearly invincible in a dive, and deadly in combat. But with its massive radial engine and small internal fuel capacity, it had a combat radius of barely 230 miles. Even with external drop tanks, that extended only to around 375 miles. That was enough to accompany the bombers over France, Belgium, and perhaps the western fringes of Germany, but nowhere near Berlin, or Schweinfurt, or Regensburg, or the Ruhr industrial basin. The P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine interceptor famed for its distinctive twin booms, could fly farther about 450 miles combat radius, but it suffered from crippling reliability issues in the cold, thin air of northern Europe. At high altitude, its turbochargers froze, its engines sputtered and quit, and pilots found themselves suddenly gliding helplessly through flak-filled skies. Crews called it getting P-38, a grim joke for a deadly failure. Worse still, the Lightning was needed in too many theaters at once: the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. There were never enough to cover the skies over Germany. That left the bombers to face the enemy alone. Every time the escort fighters reached their fuel limits and turned back toward England, the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighter controllers knew exactly where the escort's range ended. They had been tracking the Americans for months. They positioned their interceptors just beyond that invisible line in the sky. Once the Thunderbolts or Lightnings banked west, hundreds of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds would dive into the bomber formations like wolves attacking a herd. The American crews called it going naked. The Germans called it happy hunting time. The results were catastrophic. On the 17th of August, 1943, A massive force of B-17 seconds set out to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft plants at Regensburg, critical targets deep inside Germany. As the bombers crossed the border, their escorting P-47 seconds reached the limit of their fuel. The Thunderbolts turned home. Almost immediately, German radar operators vectored in more than 300 enemy fighters. They came in waves, head-on attacks, slashing through the bomber boxes, then looping back for another pass. Within minutes, the sky turned into chaos. Lieutenant Robert Harriman's B-17 was hit first. Cannon shells ripped through the right wing, igniting the No. 3 engine. The flames spread rapidly despite the crew's desperate efforts. When the bomber fell out of formation, it was immediately swarmed by FW 190 seconds. The tail section sheared away. 3 men managed to bail out. 7 died as the plane spiraled into the countryside below. All told, that day cost the 8th Air Force 36 bombers and 360 men killed or captured beyond the range of fighter cover. And that was only the beginning. On September 6, Captain James O'Connor's B-24 group attacked the Bosch Magneto Works near Stuttgart, another vital industrial target. The escorting P-38 seconds turned back over western Germany, 400 miles from home base. Just 30 seconds later, German fighters struck. "We're under attack, 15 to 20 bandits." O'Connor radioed. "Where are our fighters?" There was no answer. No one was coming. His bomber took multiple 20mm cannon hits, the right-wing fuel tank exploded, and the aircraft rolled inverted and dove from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were seen. 10 men gone in seconds. By October 1943, the cumulative losses were becoming unbearable. The 8th Air Force had lost 194 heavy bombers in just 3 months. That meant roughly 2,000 men, pilots, navigators, gunners killed or captured. Crews knew their odds. They flew anyway. But morale was breaking. The most infamous disaster came on the 14th of October 1943, a day burned into the memory of every airman as Black Thursday. On that morning, 320 B-17 seconds took off for a second raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing works. The German defences were ready. Once the short-range escorts turned back near Aachen, the bombers were left naked again. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight, more than 300 fighters, attacking in coordinated waves. By the time the surviving bombers staggered home, 60 had been shot down, another 17 destroyed beyond repair, and nearly 600 airmen were dead or prisoners. Dozens of aircraft limped back to England so riddled with holes that they could never fly again. The loss rate was 29%, nearly 1 in 3. No air force in the world could sustain such attrition for long. At headquarters, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, reviewed the numbers and ordered an immediate halt to deep penetration missions. He had no choice. The bomber crews were exhausted, the replacements arriving with only a few weeks of training. Many rookies were killed on their very first mission. The daylight bombing campaign, the core of the Allied air strategy, was dying before it could achieve its purpose. The tragedy was that the bombers were succeeding whenever they survived. Their bombs were hitting key targets, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, aircraft factories, but at an impossible cost. The German defences were simply too strong once the fighters turned back. The Luftwaffe's Jagdwaffe, its fighter arm, was led by battle-hardened aces with hundreds of kills, men like Adolf Galland, Walter Nowotny, and Johannes Steinhoff. They understood the geometry of air combat perfectly. They waited beyond escort range, then attacked in overwhelming numbers, focusing on isolated formations or stragglers. The German aircraft, especially the FW-190, were built for this kind of fight. Fast, heavily armed, capable of making devastating head-on passes through the bomber boxes. A B-17 bristled with 13 .50 caliber machine guns. But the gunners could not stop a determined fighter pilot diving straight at them at over 400 miles per hour. The German pilots aimed for the engines, the cockpit, or the thin-skinned wing tanks. When a B-17 caught fire at altitude, it burned like a torch. The cold air turned the flames into brilliant orange trails that could be seen for miles. Crews sometimes watched their friends' aircraft fall, breaking apart in the air, the black silhouettes of parachutes scattered against the grey sky. And the Luftwaffe pilots knew all of it. They knew exactly where the American escorts would leave and how long it took the bombers to reach them afterward. They set their watches by it. They had maps showing the escort limit lines drawn in red across Germany. As soon as the Americans crossed those lines, the Germans attacked. By late 1943, even the most optimistic strategists in London and Washington had to admit that the daylight bombing offensive might collapse entirely unless the escort problem was solved. The British had already switched to night bombing to minimize losses, relying on mass area attacks by Lancasters and Halifaxes. The Americans, however, believed in precision daylight bombing using the Norden bomb sight to strike specific industrial targets. But without fighter protection, precision meant suicide. In briefings, General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, warned that without long-range escort fighters, the strategic campaign would fail, and with it, the planned invasion of Europe. The reasoning was clear. Before Allied troops could land on the continent, the Luftwaffe had to be destroyed. Otherwise, any invasion fleet would be slaughtered from the air. The problem wasn't courage or tactics, it was physics. The bombers could reach Germany, the fighters couldn't. Every escort aircraft in the US arsenal simply ran out of gas too soon. The Spitfire, beloved by the RAF, was superb in combat but useless for long-range missions. Even with extra tanks, it could barely reach Paris and back. The Thunderbolt was too thirsty. The Lightning was too fragile. The bomber crews were paying the price. In December 1943, one crewman wrote in his diary, "We fly straight into hell, hour after hour, and when the fighters leave us, you can feel the fear in the ship. Everyone knows what's coming." They went anyway. Because if the bombers stopped flying, the war would stall. Germany's factories would keep turning out tanks, guns, and planes. The invasion of France, already in planning, would face an intact Luftwaffe. The war could drag on for years. Something had to change. The solution would come from a new aircraft few had yet taken seriously, the P-51 Mustang. In the winter of 1943, only a handful of American pilots had flown it. Those who had were stunned by its performance and its range. Quietly, behind the scenes, a revolution was taking shape, one that would soon end the crisis of 1943 and change the course of the air war forever. The P-51 Mustang was never meant to be a legend. In fact, it began as a rushed compromise, an improvisation born out of desperation. Its creation was one of those rare moments in wartime industry when necessity, genius, and luck collided to produce something far greater than anyone expected. The story began in April 1940, long before the United States entered the war. Across the Atlantic, Britain stood alone against Hitler's expanding empire. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe ruled European skies. The Royal Air Force, battered and exhausted from the Battle of Britain, desperately needed more fighters. British aircraft factories were already operating beyond capacity. So the British Purchasing Commission turned to the United States, seeking to buy American planes under contract. Their first request was simple. They wanted Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, then the best fighter the US could offer. The commission approached North American Aviation, NAA, a California-based company best known for building trainers like the T-6 Texan. The British wanted North American to build P-42s under license, essentially mass-producing someone else's design. But NAA's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counteroffer. Instead of building an outdated aircraft, he proposed to design an entirely new one, a fighter that would outperform the P-40 inches every way, and promised to deliver a flying prototype in just 120 days. It was an outrageous claim. Designing a new fighter from scratch usually took years. Yet the British, pressed by the urgency of war, agreed. Kindleberger immediately assigned his chief engineer, Edgar Schmood, a meticulous German-born designer, to lead the project. Schmood understood that time was the enemy. He and his small team at the Inglewood plant worked day and night, sketching and drafting in pencil, calculating by slide rule, building wooden models to test in the wind tunnel. From the beginning, Schmood emphasized aerodynamic efficiency. Every line of the airplane had to reduce drag. Every curve had to make the most of the limited engine power available. The design that emerged over the next 4 months was sleek, elegant, and radically modern. The fuselage was long and smooth, the wings thin and laminar optimized to delay airflow separation and reduce drag at high speed. The air scoop under the fuselage, which would become the Mustang's most recognizable feature, was shaped not merely for cooling but to recover energy from the radiator airflow, producing a small amount of additional thrust at high speed. It was an engineering trick that no one had tried on a production fighter before. By September 1940, barely 117 days after the contract was signed, the prototype known internally as NA-73X was ready to fly. It was a miracle of industrial speed. On the 26th of October 1940, test pilot Vance Breese climbed into the cockpit at Mines Field, Los Angeles, and pushed the throttle forward. The sleek new aircraft leapt off the ground and climbed easily into the California sky. From the first flight, it was clear that the Mustang was something special. It handled beautifully, was stable at high speed, and had exceptional range. The British immediately placed an order for 320 aircraft, which they named the Mustang Moke-Ayer. But there was a catch. The NA-73X was powered by the Allison V1710 engine, the same one used in the P-40. It was reliable and rugged, but its single-stage supercharger limited performance at altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost power rapidly, and that was a fatal flaw. The air war over Europe was fought between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, where bombers flew and where the Luftwaffe's fighters hunted them. The early Mustang could never survive there. So, while the British praised the plane's agility and speed at low altitude, they relegated it to reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Pilots loved how far it could fly and how gracefully it handled, but as a high-altitude fighter, it simply couldn't compete with German Bf 109 seconds or Foch 190 seconds. For a time, it seemed destined to remain a footnote, another good but limited design. Then came the idea that changed everything. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, took one of the early Allison-powered Mustangs for a flight. He was immediately struck by the aircraft's aerodynamic excellence, its smooth, low-drag frame and remarkable stability. When he landed, he wrote a brief but decisive report. "The airframe is superb. If fitted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it would be the best fighter in the world. The Merlin 61 engine, used in late-model Spitfires, was one of the most advanced engines in existence. It featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained power even above 30,000 feet. The combination of the Mustang's aerodynamics and the Merlin's high-altitude power promised performance that could surpass anything flying over Europe. Rolls-Royce engineers decided to test the idea. They obtained 5 Mustang airframes from the RAF and fitted them with Merlin engines. The first prototype flew in October 1942, and the results stunned everyone. The aircraft's top speed jumped from 365 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The climb rate nearly doubled. The service ceiling increased from 31,000 feet to over 42,000. It could now match the Spitfire in agility and far exceed it in range. A legend had just been born. News of the experiment reached North American aviation, and soon the U.S. Army Air Forces ordered the same modification. Packard Motor Company began building the Merlin under license in the United States, where it was redesignated as the Packard V16503. The Mustang was reborn as the P-51B and P-51C, identical models produced at different plants. Externally, the new Mustang looked similar to its predecessor, but inside, it was a different animal entirely. The aircraft could now cruise comfortably at over 400 miles per hour, reach 30,000 feet in under 8 minutes, and fight on equal or better terms with any German aircraft in the sky. Most remarkable of all was its range. The original Mustang had already carried more fuel than most single-engine fighters, 184 gallons in internal tanks, once production added an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the cockpit. With 2 108-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings, the total fuel load reached nearly 400 gallons. That gave the Mustang a flight endurance of over 6 hours and a combat radius of 850 miles, far beyond the reach of any other Allied fighter. There was, however, a serious drawback. The addition of the fuselage tank behind the pilot moved the aircraft's center of gravity rearward, making it dangerously unstable in pitch when full. Test pilots reported that when the fuselage tank was full, the Mustang could suddenly tuck up in a high-speed pull-out or loop, forcing the pilot to push the stick forward to avoid tumbling. It was an unnerving, sometimes deadly characteristic. The solution was careful fuel management. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank first, keeping the center of gravity forward before entering combat. It required discipline, attention, and constant calculation, but in return, it gave them the reach they needed to go anywhere in Germany and come home again. By late 1943, the Merlin-powered Mustang was entering production in large numbers. Pilots who flew it for the first time could hardly believe it. It was fast, nimble, and astonishingly smooth. It could turn with a Bf-109, dive with an FW-190, and still have enough fuel to chase them across the entire country. Major Thomas J. Hitchcock, the U.S. Air Attaché in London and a key advocate for the Mustang, sent an urgent cable to Washington. The P-51 is the plane we have been looking for. It can escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. This is the long-range fighter we need. At first, there was skepticism. Many in the U.S. Army Air Forces were deeply invested in the Thunderbolt and the Lightning. But after a handful of operational missions in late 1943, the results were undeniable. Mustangs escorted bombers deeper into Germany than any single-engine aircraft in history and came home. In December 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew the first combat missions with the P-51B over France and Western Germany. The aircraft proved everything the engineers had promised. It shot down German interceptors, protected the bombers, and returned with fuel to spare. The pilots were ecstatic. They had finally found a machine that could win the air war. The Mustang was the perfect balance of performance, range, and reliability, the first true long-range escort fighter. Its creation had taken less than 4 years from first sketch to combat debut, an astonishing achievement. But beyond the technical marvels lay something deeper, the realization that range mattered more than anything else. All the speed and firepower in the world meant nothing if you couldn't reach the fight. The P-51 could, and soon it would go where no fighter had ever gone before, straight into the skies above Berlin. By late 1943, the war in the air had reached a mathematical deadlock. The American bombers could reach any target in Germany, but without protection, too many of them died on the way. The American fighters could win any dogfight, but they could not fly far enough to be there when it mattered most. Every mission beyond Western Germany ended in slaughter. The problem wasn't bravery or tactics, it was range. The Luftwaffe knew exactly how far the US escort fighters could go, and they built their entire defensive strategy around that fact. Beyond roughly 400 miles from England, the bombers were alone. German fighter controllers plotted those limits on their maps and waited patiently for the Americans to cross them. When the thunderbolts and lightnings turned back, the sky filled with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. By December 1943, the crisis was clear to everyone in the US 8th Air Force. Unless the range problem was solved, the daylight bombing campaign would fail, and with it, perhaps, the coming Allied invasion of France. Then came the P-51 Mustang, and the quiet realization that the solution already existed. The new aircraft had been arriving in England through the winter, replacing the short-legged Thunderbolts and unreliable Lightnings in small numbers. Its Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it the high-altitude power to match German fighters. Its aerodynamics made it faster and smoother than anything else in the air. But its true gift was not its speed, it was its endurance. The Mustang's fuel system was revolutionary for a single-engine fighter. Inside the wings were 2 large integral tanks, holding 184 gallons combined. Behind the cockpit sat another 85-gallon fuselage tank, installed midway through production to extend the aircraft's range even farther. And under each wing, the Mustang could carry 2 108-gallon drop tanks, light disposable cylinders made of pressed paper and glue, produced in British factories by the thousands. With all tanks filled, the P-51 carried nearly 400 gallons of fuel, an astonishing figure for an aircraft that weighed only about 10,000 pounds loaded. It could cruise for over 6 hours and had a combat radius of more than 850 miles. That number was the miracle. It meant the Mustang could take off from England, climb over the North Sea, cross the Dutch coast, fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and still have enough fuel to come home. For the first time, an American fighter could go the distance. But like every miracle in aviation, it came with a catch. The additional fuselage tank, the very thing that gave the Mustang its range, was located behind the pilot's seat, well aft of the center of gravity. When full, the weight of that fuel shifted the balance of the aircraft dangerously to the rear. The result was a plane that could become wildly unstable in pitch, especially during tight turns or pullouts from dives. Test pilots quickly discovered the problem. With a full fuselage tank, the Mustang would pitch up unexpectedly in a hard maneuver. In some cases, the control stick would suddenly reverse, meaning the pilot had to push forward rather than pull back to keep the nose from rising further. It was an unnatural and terrifying sensation, the kind that could kill a pilot in seconds if he reacted the wrong way. The official reports were blunt. Aircraft unstable in pitch with fuselage tank full. Violent maneuvers may cause loss of control. The solution was discipline and precision. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank first. The fuel from behind the seat had to be used up before entering combat. It was not a suggestion, it was survival. A Mustang loaded for a Berlin mission was a flying fuel tank with guns attached. At takeoff it was heavy, sluggish and nose-light. Pilots climbed carefully, avoiding sudden turns. Once they reached cruising altitude, they switched their fuel selector to draw from the fuselage tank and began to burn it down, gallon by gallon. The aircraft gradually stabilized as the balance shifted forward. By the time they neared enemy airspace, the rear tank was empty or nearly so, and the Mustang was once again the nimble, lethal machine it was meant to be. Flying the Mustang was as much mathematics as combat. Every pilot had to calculate his fuel consumption, constantly climb rate, cruise speed, drop tank use, reserve fuel for the return leg. A single mistake could mean running out of fuel hundreds of miles over enemy territory. Colonel Donald Blakeslee drilled this into his men when his 4th Fighter Group began converting to P-51 seconds in early 1944. Each pilot was personally responsible for managing his fuel. Blakeslee was relentless. "If you run out of gas over Germany," he told them, "don't bother calling home. You're on your own." But when the pilots learned how to handle it, the Mustang became unstoppable. The drop tanks were another crucial innovation. They were cheap, light, and expendable, made of impregnated paper instead of metal to save aluminum for bombers. When full, they gave the Mustang an extra 216 gallons of fuel, enough to fly deep into Germany. When empty or when combat began, the pilot could jettison them instantly with a flick of a switch. The tanks fell away, tumbling through the air, and the Mustang became light and agile again. These paper tanks were a small miracle of logistics. They were built in British factories, often by civilian women, in the thousands each week. They cost a fraction of the metal tanks used earlier and could be produced faster than the Germans could shoot them down. With these systems working together, the fuselage tank, the wing tanks, the drop tanks, the Mustang had what the Luftwaffe considered impossible: strategic range in a tactical fighter. Before the P-51, American fighter missions had been carefully planned around their limited endurance. Each flight had to turn back at a specific radius of no return. Luftwaffe pilots knew those distances as well as the Americans did. They waited just beyond them. Now, the tables turned. When Mustangs began escorting bombers into central Germany in early 1944, German radar stations tracked them as usual, expecting them to peel away near Hanover or Bremen. But they didn't. They kept coming across the Elbe toward Berlin. German controllers were stunned. Pilots who climbed to intercept the bombers suddenly found themselves face to face with American fighters that should have been hundreds of miles away. At first, the Luftwaffe assumed it was a trick. They believed these must be twin-engine aircraft refueled somewhere on the continent. But when wreckage from downed Mustangs was recovered, German engineers found nothing exotic, just clever design and extra fuel tanks. There was no secret technology, no hidden base. The Americans had simply built a fighter that could carry enough fuel to reach Berlin. The psychological impact was enormous. For 2 years, German pilots had fought with the confidence of knowing their home skies were safe from Allied fighters. Now that illusion vanished overnight. By early 1944, the Mustangs were flying all the way to Berlin and back, escorting bomber streams every mile of the journey. For the first time in the war, the bombers had protection from takeoff to target to return. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait at the edge of escort range. They had to fight everywhere, every day, over every factory and city. And the cost to them was devastating. Every engagement now favored the Americans. The Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were dwindling, their replacement pilots poorly trained. The Mustangs, meanwhile, were arriving in ever greater numbers, flown by experienced veterans who had learned to fight as a team. The combination of range, performance, and reliability made the P-51 a weapon unlike any other. It wasn't the fastest aircraft in the world. It wasn't the most heavily armed. But it could be there at the critical point, at the critical time, and stay there until the job was done. The Mustang's long legs changed not only tactics but strategy itself. For the first time, the 8th Air Force could plan deep penetration missions without fear of catastrophic losses. Targets that had once been untouchable, the ball-bearing factories, the oil refineries, the aircraft assembly plants, were now within reach. By the spring of 1944, American fighter groups had mastered the art of fuel discipline. They knew when to drop tanks, when to switch, when to save the last gallon for the final glide back to England. The Mustang turned the impossible mission into a routine operation. The Luftwaffe had built its war around the assumption that no Allied fighter could ever reach Berlin. The Mustang shattered that assumption completely. It wasn't just a new airplane, it was the end of a myth. When the first silver P-51 seconds appeared in the skies over Germany's capital, even the most hardened German pilots understood instantly what it meant. The Americans had solved the range problem. From that day forward, nowhere in the Reich was safe. And for the men who flew the bombers, men who had spent months watching their friends go down in flames beyond escort range, those gleaming Mustangs meant something more than strategy or fuel calculations. They meant hope. By the beginning of 1944, the Allies finally had the weapon they needed, the P-51 Mustang. What they needed next was a commander bold enough to use it to its full potential, someone who would take the new fighter where no one had dared to go before. That man was Colonel Donald James Blakeslee. Blakeslee was already a legend in the air by the time the first P-51Bs reached England. He had flown with the Royal Air Force's Eagle Squadron long before America entered the war, and later became one of the top combat leaders in the US 8th Air Force. He was respected by his men, feared by his enemies, and tolerated barely by his superiors. He was known for being blunt, impatient with bureaucracy, and utterly fearless in the air. He lived for flying, for combat, and for winning. When Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he quickly recognized that Blakeslee was exactly the kind of commander he needed, someone who could turn the Mustang from a promising prototype into a war-winning weapon. At that moment, Blakeslee commanded the 4th Fighter Group, based at Debden Airfield in Essex. The 4th had a long and proud lineage. It was the direct descendant of the RAF's American Eagle squadrons. Its pilots were veterans, experienced, aggressive, and deeply loyal to one another. For more than a year, they had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts, escorting bombers as far as their fuel allowed before turning back, frustrated to watch the bombers vanish into German territory alone. When Blakeslee heard about the new long-range Mustang, he knew instantly what it meant. "That's the airplane we've been waiting for," he told his staff. "Get me those Mustangs, and I'll take them to Berlin." Oh. But there was a problem. Converting an entire fighter group to a new aircraft was no small task. Pilots had to be retrained. Mechanics had to learn new engines, new systems, new maintenance routines. It normally took weeks, sometimes months, to complete the transition. During that time, the group would be grounded, no missions, no escorts, no combat. General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, hesitated. He couldn't afford to lose one of his most effective units just as the 8th Air Force was preparing to strike deeper into Germany. Blakeslee didn't wait for permission. He walked into Kepner's office and made a wager. "Give me the P-51 seconds," he said, "and I'll have my group combat, ready in 24 hours. Kepner thought he was joking. 24 days, maybe, he replied. Not 24 hours. Blakeslee didn't flinch. We've flown Spitfires before, he said. We know the Merlin engine. My ground crews can handle it. Give us the planes, and we'll fly them into combat tomorrow. Kepner, half amused and half incredulous, agreed, but with a warning. If your group isn't operational in 24 hours, Blakeslee, you're finished. The challenge was on. The 4th Fighter Group received its first P-51B Mustangs on the 26th of February 1944. They arrived at Debden, still smelling of fresh paint, their new engines barely broken in. Mechanics swarmed over them immediately, learning on the fly literally how to service the Merlin engine, how to install the new drop tanks, how to adjust the guns and calibrate the sights. That night, they worked under floodlights in the freezing cold, tightening bolts, filling fuel tanks, and checking systems until dawn. Meanwhile, Blakeslee gathered his pilots in the briefing hut and issued the simplest order they had ever heard. Learn to fly them on the way to the target. Rand. Some of his men had never even sat in a Mustang before. A few had only 30 minutes of flight time in the new aircraft before being ordered into combat. But they trusted their commander. They knew that if anyone could pull it off, it was Blakeslee. On February 28, less than 48 hours after receiving their new planes, the 4th Fighter Group flew its first mission in P-51 seconds, an escort raid over northern France. Every Mustang returned safely. The conversion had taken exactly as long as Blakeslee promised. He had kept his word, and his reputation for impossible efficiency became legend. Now he was ready for the real test. By early March, enough P-51 seconds had reached England to attempt what American planners had been dreaming of for months, a daylight raid on Berlin with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. It would be the first time in history that single-engine fighters struck directly at the heart of Nazi Germany. The first attempt was scheduled for the 3rd of March 1944, but bad weather forced a postponement. The second attempt, 2 days later, also had to be scrubbed. On the morning of March 6, the skies finally cleared enough for a go signal. The mission would be enormous, over 600 heavy bombers and nearly 900 fighters, flying together in a massive wave across northern Europe. The 4th Fighter Group would be at the spearhead, with Blakeslee himself leading 48 Mustangs. Briefing began before dawn in a cold, dimly lit operations room. The men crowded around the mission map as Blakeslee explained the plan. A long, looping route northeast across the North Sea. Then inland over the Netherlands and northern Germany, straight to Berlin. The bombers' target was the city's industrial district factories, rail yards, and aircraft plants. The Mustangs' job was to keep the Luftwaffe away from them at all costs. The intelligence officers warned that 300 to 400 German fighters were expected to defend the capital. Blakeslee didn't seem concerned. He simply nodded and said, "Good. Maybe they'll all be up there, and we won't have to go looking for them." At 7:42, the first Mustangs roared down Debden's runway. The early morning air was heavy with mist, the engines thundering as one after another lifted off into the grey English sky. Each plane carried 2 108-gallon drop tanks under its wings, plus a full load of 50-caliber ammunition, 6 guns, 300 rounds each. They climbed to rendezvous altitude and headed east, crossing the coast of the Netherlands shortly after 9. Below them, the bomber formations stretched for nearly 70 miles, a vast procession of silver shapes glinting in the sunlight. The radio crackled with Blakeslee's voice. "4th Group, tighten it up. We're going to Berlin." As they approached the German border, contrails began to appear ahead, thin white streaks climbing to intercept. The Luftwaffe was coming. At 9:58, the first wave of enemy fighters attacked. Dozens of Bf 109 seconds and Fly 190 seconds dove from above, aiming for the bomber stream. Blakeslee called out, "Bandits 11 o'clock, high 20 plus," and rolled into a climbing turn. The sky erupted into chaos. For 7 furious minutes, Mustangs and Messerschmitts tangled in spiraling dogfights above the bomber formation. The American fighters blocked every attack, turning inside the Germans, forcing them to break off. Blakeslee's guns jammed after a short burst, but he kept flying aggressively, positioning his aircraft to protect his men. Major James Goodson destroyed two foe 192nds in quick succession. Captain Don Gentile shot down a Bf-109 from 200 yards, watching it explode in a fireball. When the smoke cleared, the 4th Fighter Group had 5 confirmed kills, no losses, and, more importantly, not a single bomber in their charge had been shot down by enemy fighters. Above Berlin, the bombers released their payloads through a storm of flak. From 30,000 feet, Blakeslee could see the city below grey streets, rail lines, the serpentine curve of the Spree River, and the flashes of hundreds of bombs exploding. Columns of smoke rose from the city centre. Berlin, the city that Hitler had called the heart of the Reich, was burning in daylight. When the formations turned west for home, more German fighters tried to intercept the stragglers, but the Mustangs stayed with them every mile of the way across Germany, across the Netherlands, and out over the North Sea. After nearly 7 hours in the air, Blakeslee's Mustang touched down at Debden at 1,400 hours. His fuel gauges were almost empty, just 20 gallons remaining, barely 10 minutes of flight time. Every one of his 48 aircraft had returned. Not one had been lost. The mission was an overwhelming success. For the first time, American bombers had reached Berlin and back under continuous fighter escort. What the Americans didn't yet know was that in Berlin that very morning, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, had watched the battle from his headquarters. He saw the contrails of American fighters high above the city and realized the impossible had happened. He turned to his staff and said the words that would later echo through history. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." For the men of the 4th Fighter Group, it was just another day's work, another mission completed. But for the Luftwaffe, it marked the end of an era. The myth of invulnerability over the Reich was shattered. From that day forward, the Americans could strike any target in Germany with fighter escort. There would be no sanctuary, no safe distance, no place the Luftwaffe could hide. And it had all begun with one determined colonel, 48 Mustangs, and a promise made in a cold English winter. "Give me the P-51 seconds and I'll take them to Berlin." Von Sau? The sky over Germany on the morning of the 6th of March 1944 was a vast grey ocean of contrails, gunfire, and death. For the first time in history, American fighters escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and the Luftwaffe, desperate and furious, threw everything it had into the fight. The day would go down in history as Black Monday, a day when the air war over Europe reached its breaking point, and the balance of power shifted forever. The battle over the Reich. At dawn, more than 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators took off from airfields across eastern England. Their target was Berlin itself: factories, marshalling yards, and industrial complexes scattered across the German capital. Accompanying them were nearly 900 escort fighters, including the new long-range P-51 Mustangs of Colonel Donald Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group. It was the largest air armada ever assembled in the European theatre. The contrails stretched across the sky like white scars, converging into a single, glistening corridor leading deep into Germany's heart. For the German defenders, this was a moment of both defiance and despair. The Luftwaffe command knew that the Americans had finally solved their range problem. They had seen the Mustangs reach Berlin 2 days earlier, but Göring refused to accept defeat. He ordered every available fighter Bf-109 seconds, FW-190 seconds, even training units to intercept the invaders. By mid-morning, more than 500 German fighters were climbing into the cold March sky. They came from every direction: Hanover, Brunswick, Magdeburg, Leipzig. Pilots who had once been invincible now faced an enemy that could fight them anywhere. The clash begins. At 10:20 a.m., as the bomber stream approached Berlin, radar operators on the ground tracked over 1,500 aircraft engaged in combat. The Luftwaffe struck in coordinated waves, first head-on attacks by veteran Jägergeschwader fighter wings, followed by slashing side passes from Focke-Wulf 192nd armed with 20mm cannon. For months, this tactic had worked flawlessly. The German fighters would dive through the bomber formations, rip them apart, and escape before the slower American escorts could catch up. But now the escorts didn't turn back. They were right there in the thick of the fight. Blakeslee's P-51 seconds intercepted the first German wave just west of Berlin. The sky became a swirling chaos of contrails, diving aircraft, and gunfire. The Mustangs met the enemy head-on, their 50 caliber guns tearing through the formations. Major James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group recalled later, "It wasn't a dogfight, it was a slaughter. The Germans came in confident, as they always did, and suddenly realized we were everywhere. The Mustangs had the speed to climb with the Messerschmitts, the range to stay in the fight, and the power to pursue them all the way home. When the German fighters tried to disengage, the Mustangs followed, shooting them down over their own airfields. In one of the most intense engagements of the war, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 70 fighters in a single morning. The shock to the Luftwaffe. Among the German pilots that day was Major Günther Rohl, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 250 victories. Rohl later admitted that the first time he saw the Mustang in combat, he realized the Luftwaffe's dominance was finished. The Mustang was faster, could dive better, and could turn inside you. It had incredible range. Once they came, we knew we could no longer control the air. The Mustang's arrival meant that Germany's tactical advantage, the ability to dictate when and where to fight, was gone. Now it was the Americans who chose the battlefield. The Luftwaffe had built its entire strategy around controlling the air over Germany's industrial core. But that day, their home skies were no longer safe. Even veteran German commanders like Johannes Steinhoff admitted later that the morale of their pilots began to collapse after Black Monday. "We could fight," Steinhoff said, "but we could no longer win." The numbers tell the story. The cost of the day was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, a heavy blow by any measure, but the Luftwaffe's losses were far worse. In just a few hours of combat, they lost over 160 aircraft and dozens of their irreplaceable veteran pilots. For Germany, it was a disaster. By this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe was running out of both fuel and trained men. Their once experienced Jägergeschwader had been filled with green recruits who barely had 30 hours of flight time. Against disciplined, battle-hardened American pilots flying the most advanced fighter in the world, they stood no chance. The skies over Berlin were thick with burning wreckage that day, black trails of smoke marking where proud German pilots had gone down. Göring's moment of realization. In his headquarters on the Wilhelmstrasse, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring watched the battle unfold through binoculars. Outside, the air raid sirens wailed. He could see contrails crisscrossing above Berlin and the faint flashes of dogfights glinting in the Sunday. He had been assured by his engineers that this could never happen. The Americans, they said, did not possess a single-engine fighter capable of reaching Berlin. And yet, there they were, hundreds of them escorting bombers through the skies of the Reich's capital. As the American formations turned west, Göring turned to his aides and muttered, almost to himself, "I knew then that we had lost the air war." The words would later echo through history, the confession of a man who had built his reputation on the myth of German air superiority. The domino effect. After Black Monday, the Luftwaffe began to collapse not overnight but inevitably. Each day that followed brought another raid, another escort mission, another defeat. The Mustangs returned again and again, deeper each time, hunting German fighters wherever they took off. Soon the 8th Air Force shifted its strategy. Instead of merely protecting bombers, the fighters were ordered to free hunt to range ahead of the formations and destroy the Luftwaffe before it could even reach the bombers. Colonel Zemke, another legendary Mustang commander, called it the Airman's Liberation. For the first time, American pilots were no longer chained to the bombers' slow speed and rigid formations. They could roam freely, attack at will, and dominate the skies. The results were devastating. By April 1944, German aircraft losses had more than doubled compared to the previous year. Factory production could not keep up. Even as new fighters rolled off the assembly lines, the Luftwaffe had no experienced men left to fly them. The American fighters had not only destroyed their opponents in combat, they had destroyed the entire system that produced them. Courage and cost. Yet victory did not come without sacrifice. Every Mustang that reached Berlin risked 7 or 8 hours of continuous flight through flak, enemy fighters, freezing temperatures, and mechanical failure. Pilots returned with bullet holes in their wings, flak damage to their radiators, and sometimes blood freezing on their oxygen masks. The Mustang's range gave them life, but it also meant they fought far from home, with no hope of rescue if they went down. Lieutenant Bill Overstreet of the 357th Fighter Group recalled one mission when his aircraft was hit over Berlin. His canopy was shattered, his controls half frozen, yet he managed to dive through the city, pursued by a Messerschmitt, and escape over the Tiergarten. Years later he said, "It wasn't bravery, it was survival." Stories like his became the legend of the Mustang pilots, young men who crossed half a continent to fight, outnumbered but never outmatched. The turning of the tide. By spring 1944, the effects of these missions were unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was broken. Its once proud fighter arm, which had ruled the skies over Europe for nearly 5 years, was now in retreat. German pilots who survived spoke openly of exhaustion, of hopelessness, of being hunted in their own airspace. For the Americans, the long nightmare of unescorted bombing was finally over. Losses among bomber crews dropped dramatically. Where once 1 out of every 5 bombers failed to return, now it was 1 in 50. The bombers could now strike at oil refineries, aircraft plants, and transportation hubs deep inside Germany, targets that had once been untouchable. The Luftwaffe's fuel production collapsed under the onslaught. Airfields were cratered, repair depots destroyed. Within months, Germany's ability to wage aerial warfare had been crippled beyond recovery. The air belonged to the Allies, a new kind of sky. Black Monday was more than just a battle, it was the day the balance of power in the air shifted permanently. The Luftwaffe never recovered from it. From that point forward, every German fighter that took off faced an enemy that was faster, higher, and always waiting. The P-51 Mustang had done more than escort bombers, it had claimed air superiority over Europe. And in doing so, it opened the door to everything that would follow. The destruction of the Reich's war industry, the D-Day invasion, and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. As one German pilot later said, with grim respect, "When the Mustangs came, the war in the air was over. We just hadn't admitted it yet." By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. What just 6 months earlier had been a deadly trap for American bomber crews was now the stage of Allied dominance. The P-51 Mustang had not only solved the range problem, it had rewritten the rules of air warfare. For the first time, the 8th Air Force could send bomber formations to any point in Nazi Germany with the confidence that they would have fighter protection every mile of the way. This single change transformed the strategic bombing campaign from a desperate gamble into a decisive weapon of war, from defense to domination. Before the Mustangs' arrival, the mission of the American fighter groups had been almost purely defensive. Their duty was to protect the bombers as far as they could, and then turn back before fuel exhaustion doomed them. The Germans always knew when the escorts would leave, and that knowledge gave them tactical superiority. But by April 1944, that pattern was shattered. The Mustangs did not turn back. They stayed with the bombers all the way to the target, and then under new orders from General James Doolittle they kept on flying. Doolittle's strategy was as bold as it was simple. He told his fighter commanders, "Your mission is no longer to protect the bombers. Your mission is to destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find it." It was a fundamental shift in doctrine. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack the bombers, the Mustangs were now free to hunt the Luftwaffe wherever they took off, wherever they landed, and wherever they tried to hide. Fighter groups like Blakeslee's 4th, Hub Zemke's 56th, and John Meyer's 352nd began launching deep penetration sweeps, racing ahead of the bomber formations, seeking out enemy airfields, and striking them before the German fighters could even get airborne. These missions were brutal and effective. The Mustangs would arrive at low altitude, guns blazing, raking parked aircraft, hangars, fuel dumps, and convoys. Airfields across western and central Germany were left in smoking ruins. In 1 week alone, the 8th Fighter Command claimed over 400 German aircraft destroyed on the ground. For the Luftwaffe, it was catastrophic. The Americans were no longer waiting to be attacked. They were bringing the war directly to the fighter bases themselves. The collapse of the Luftwaffe. The effect of these new tactics was immediate and devastating. The Luftwaffe's losses skyrocketed. In March 1944, the German fighter arm lost around 350 aircraft in combat. By April, that number had doubled. By May, it had doubled again. German aircraft production was still rising thanks to the forced labor of thousands of workers, but it no longer mattered. The Luftwaffe was losing its pilots faster than it could train replacements. The new recruits arriving at airfields in 1944 had barely 150 to 200 hours of total flight time, half of what their predecessors had received earlier in the war. Many had never even fired their guns in flight before being sent into combat. Against experienced American pilots with hundreds of hours in the air, they were hopelessly outmatched. The attrition was merciless. Every week, more German aces were killed or captured. The proud Jägerschwader, fighter wings, that had once ruled the skies were now skeletal remnants of their former selves. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top fighter commander, sent increasingly desperate reports to Göring, pleading for more aircraft, more fuel, more time to train his men. Göring had nothing left to give. The synthetic fuel plants that powered the German war machine were now under relentless attack by American bombers, and the Mustangs made sure those bombers reached their targets. By May 1944, Germany was producing aircraft it could no longer fly. Some fighter units received brand new planes that never left the ground for lack of fuel. Mechanics siphoned gasoline from staff cars just to keep a few aircraft operational for takeoff alerts. The Luftwaffe's great engine had run out of fuel literally and figuratively. The numbers shift. The results were stark and measurable. In October 1943, before the P-51 entered combat, the average bomber loss rate on deep missions over Germany was around 8% per mission, 1 in every 12 bombers shot down. By April 1944, after only 3 months of Mustang escort, that figure had fallen to less than 2%. For the first time, the 8th Air Force could plan raids on targets anywhere in the Reich with acceptable losses. The oil refineries of Lohna and Pörlitz, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, the aircraft plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, and the marshalling yards that fed the German army all became fair game. Every successful raid tore another hole in Germany's industrial system. The Luftwaffe couldn't defend them, and the German army couldn't fight without them. Doolittle's vision. General Doolittle understood that victory in the air was not just about shooting down enemy planes, it was about denying them the ability to fight at all. Under his leadership, the fighter strategy shifted from escorting to offense-based air superiority. Mustangs were sent out in small hunter-killer teams, often flying well ahead of the bomber formations. Their goal was to force the Luftwaffe to rise and fight and then destroy them piecemeal. Colonel Don Blakeslee and his 4th Fighter Group thrived under this new doctrine. They flew 5, sometimes 6 missions a week, deep into Germany, often returning with empty ammunition belts and barely enough fuel to land. The pilots became predators, sweeping across Germany's heartland at will. They strafed rail yards, truck convoys, airfields, anything that moved. The Germans began calling them Terrorflieger, terror flyers, because of their sudden, devastating attacks that came without warning and without mercy. It was not cruelty that drove the Americans, it was strategy. Every German plane destroyed on the ground was one less that could kill a bomber crew over Berlin or a soldier on the beaches of Normandy. The path to D-Day. As spring turned to summer, the effects of the Mustang campaign reached far beyond the skies. The Allied invasion of France Operation Overlord was fast approaching. Success on the beaches would depend entirely on one thing: air superiority. If the Luftwaffe still controlled the skies over France, the invasion fleet would be annihilated before it reached the shore. Doolittle's fighters were determined to make sure that never happened. In the weeks leading up to the 6th of June 1944, the Mustangs and their sister squadrons in the 9th Air Force scoured the skies and the ground, hunting anything that could fly. They bombed railways, strafed fuel depots, destroyed communications lines, and patrolled the Channel coast. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force in Western Europe was effectively gone. When the Allies launched their invasion, German radar stations tracked more than 14,000 Allied aircraft over the beaches. The Luftwaffe managed barely 100 sorties in response. Most were shot down before they reached the front. The skies over Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies, and it was the Mustang's long range that made that possible. The human cost. Victory, however, came at a price. The relentless pace of combat wore down even the most seasoned pilots. Missions lasted up to 7 hours. Many returned pale and shaking, their faces lined with exhaustion and frostbite. Mechanical failures, flak, and weather claimed nearly as many lives as enemy fire. A small hole in a radiator meant certain death, since the Mustang's liquid-cooled engine could seize in minutes. Ground crews worked themselves to the bone to keep the aircraft flying. At Debden, mechanics often performed round-the-clock maintenance, patching bullet holes, replacing engines, and reloading guns through rain and snow. They were the unsung heroes of the campaign, ensuring that each P-51 was ready to fly at dawn, no matter the cost. The strategic balance shifts. By the summer of 1944, the strategic picture was unmistakable. Germany's once feared Luftwaffe was broken. The Americans and British now controlled the air from the Channel to the Elbe. The Mustang had done more than protect the bombers, it had made the entire Allied war machine possible. With air superiority secured, bombers could cripple German industry, and ground forces could move freely across France without fear of attack from above. The Luftwaffe's decline was irreversible. Every attempt to rebuild it was destroyed on the ground by P-51 seconds and their comrades. A new kind of warfare. The lessons of the Mustang went far beyond World War II. Military planners around the world saw that range, not just speed or firepower, was the key to victory in the air. The P-51 proved that the ability to reach the enemy, to stay in the fight, and to control the sky anywhere on Earth was the true measure of air power. As historian Stephen Ambrose later wrote, the P-51 didn't just escort the bombers to Berlin, it escorted the Allies to victory. Epilogue: the turning point. By the end of May 1944, when Colonel Blakeslee looked out over Debden Airfield, he saw hundreds of Mustangs lined up wingtip to wingtip, their polished silver skins gleaming in the morning sunday. They represented more than machines, they were the embodiment of a new kind of war, a war where the Allies no longer played by the enemy's rules. The Luftwaffe had been forced to fight on American terms, at American times, and at American places. That was the true strategic turning point, the moment when the question was no longer whether the Allies could win, but when. And when the invasion fleet crossed the Channel on June 6, the Mustangs were there, circling high above the beaches, watching over the soldiers below, proof that the sky, at last, belonged to freedom. By the summer of 1944, the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang shimmered over every corner of occupied Europe. What had begun as an urgent experiment in range and endurance had become the weapon that changed the course of the air war and, with it, the outcome of the Second World War. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was now a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, exhausted pilots, and relentless American raids had broken its strength. On D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Germany managed barely 100 fighter sorties. The Allies flew more than 14,000. The contrast told the entire story. The skies now belonged to the Allies, and it was the Mustang that had made it possible, the machine that changed everything. The P-51 wasn't just another fighter. It was a masterpiece of engineering, born of necessity and imagination. Sleek, fast, and elegant, it embodied the perfect marriage of American design and British innovation. The Merlin engine, with its two-stage supercharger, gave the aircraft power at high altitude that no other Allied fighter could match. Combined with the Mustang's clean aerodynamics and massive fuel capacity, it became the first true long-range escort fighter in history. It could fly over 1,600 miles on a single mission, dive faster than most aircraft of its time, and still turn tightly enough to challenge any German opponent. Its 50 caliber Browning machine guns were devastatingly effective. But what made the Mustang truly invincible was its reach, its ability to be where it was needed, when it was needed, for as long as necessary. For bomber crews who had endured 2 years of slaughter over Germany, the sight of those polished silver Mustangs sliding into formation above them was nothing short of salvation. They called them little friends. When the Mustangs were there, survival odds doubled and morale soared. The men behind the miracle. The legend of the Mustang was written not only by engineers and generals, but by ordinary men, pilots, mechanics, and factory workers, whose combined effort turned a design into a force of history. The pilots of the 8th Air Force flew missions that tested the limits of endurance. 6-hour flights in freezing altitudes through flak and fighter attacks demanded constant focus. Their oxygen masks froze over, their hands cramped from gripping the control stick, their minds numbed from fatigue and fear. Yet they pressed on, mission after mission. Colonel Donald Blakeslee, who had led his 4th Fighter Group through the first raids to Berlin, was one of the few who truly understood the scale of what they had achieved. By October 1944, he had logged more than 1,000 combat hours, more than any other American pilot of the war. Headquarters finally ordered him grounded, fearing that losing him would devastate morale. Blakeslee protested fiercely. Flying was his life, leading his men was his purpose, but orders were orders. He returned to the United States a reluctant hero. He left behind a record few would ever match: 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 silver stars, 7 distinguished flying crosses, and countless stories told in mess halls for decades to come. Yet when journalists later asked him about the historic Berlin missions, he dismissed them with typical humility. "We did what needed to be done." The invisible heroes. Behind every Mustang that roared into the sky stood a small army of ground crewmen, the unsung mechanics, armourers, and technicians who made the impossible routine. At airfields like Debden, Bottisham, and Bassingbourn, they worked through rain, sleet, and darkness. Engines had to be replaced after just 25 flying hours. Oil leaks were common. Coolant systems froze overnight. Bullet holes riddled wings and fuselages after every mission. Each morning, before dawn, mechanics crawled under wings with flashlights in their teeth, checking fuel lines and hydraulic systems. Armourers reloaded 1,800 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition into each fighter's guns, 1 bullet at a time. Others filled the drop tanks, those fragile paper cylinders that gave the Mustang its reach, with 108 gallons of precious fuel. The pace was relentless. A single mistake could mean a pilot's death hundreds of miles away. The crews knew it, and they took it personally. Many pilots insisted on working side by side with their crew chiefs, building a trust so deep that the name painted on a Mustang's fuselage, Miss Dallas, Mary Jane, Ding Hao, belonged as much to the mechanic as to the man who flew it. They were all part of the same machine, one that reached from factory floors in California to the windswept airfields of East Anglia. Industrial might and human will. The North American aviation factories in California and Texas became miracles of wartime production. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 15,000 P-51 seconds rolled off the assembly lines. Women made up nearly half the workforce, riveting wings, wiring instrument panels, and testing control surfaces with precision and pride. In Britain, civilian plants turned out the disposable paper drop tanks by the thousands. They cost less than $20 each, but every one represented another bomber crew that would live to see home. It was the ultimate expression of industrial warfare fused with human determination, a design so efficient and a workforce so relentless that no matter how many Mustangs were lost in combat, more were always waiting. Victory in the air. By the winter of 1944-45, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its fuel reserves were gone. Its pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. On the ground, airfields were bombed into rubble. In the air, Mustangs prowled like wolves, hunting stragglers, strafing trains, and guarding the bombers that now roamed Germany at will. Even the introduction of advanced German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, came too late. The Me-262 was fast, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang, but there were too few of them, and fewer still with trained pilots. P-51 seconds destroyed many during takeoff or landing when the jets were most vulnerable. By May 1945, the air war was effectively over. Germany's cities lay in ruins, its factories silent, its skies empty. The Mustang had helped make that happen not through sheer destruction, but through control. It had taken away the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. After the war, when peace came, the P-51 continued to serve. It flew in the skies over Korea, escorting B-29 bombers on long-range missions over the peninsula. Its endurance and versatility kept it relevant even in the dawn of the jet age. Blakeslee remained in uniform, eventually commanding a fighter wing during the Korean War before retiring as a colonel in 1965. Many of his wartime comrades became test pilots, airline captains, or instructors, passing on the lessons learned in Europe's deadly skies. But even as the world moved on, the legend of the Mustang only grew. In air shows, veterans would stand with tears in their eyes as the distinct whine of the Merlin engine rolled across the crowd, the same sound that once echoed above Berlin and Normandy. The Mustang's enduring legacy. Historians and generals alike have called the P-51 the most important fighter of World War II. Senator Harry Truman's War Investigating Committee called it the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, called its appearance over Germany one of the miracles of the war. General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces, was even more direct. Without the P-51, the strategic air offensive against Germany could not have succeeded. But perhaps the most meaningful praise came from the bomber crews themselves. To them, the Mustang was not a statistic or a marvel of engineering, it was life. When they saw those sleek silver fighters sliding into escort position at 25,000 feet, they felt hope again. The Mustangs meant they might see another sunrise. More than a machine. The true legacy of the P-51 lies not only in its victories, but in what it represented. It proved that range mattered more than raw speed, that a fighter's worth was not just in how fast it could turn, but in how far it could go and still bring its pilot home. That lesson reshaped military aviation for generations. Every modern fighter, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-15 Eagle and F-35 Lightning, owes something to the philosophy born with the Mustang. Reach the enemy, fight, and return. The P-51 became a symbol of what the Allies stood for: freedom, endurance, and ingenuity under pressure. It embodied the idea that wars are won not just by weapons, but by people who refuse to accept limits. Epilogue. The day the sky belonged to freedom. On the 6th of March 1944, when Donald Blakeslee and his men first saw Berlin from the cockpits of their Mustangs, they weren't thinking of history. They were thinking of survival, of protecting bombers, of getting home with enough fuel to land. None of them could know that they had just changed the war. But they had. When those silver Mustangs appeared high above the Nazi capital that morning, circling at 30,000 feet, something fundamental shifted. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility shattered. The Americans could now strike any target, anywhere, at any time. From that day forward, the outcome of the air war and the war itself was only a matter of time. Years later, when historians asked Hermann Göring what had doomed the Luftwaffe, he answered without hesitation, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine, it was the instrument of that realization. It was the bridge between endurance and victory, between fear and freedom. And in the long silence that followed the war, when the contrails faded and the bombers no longer flew, its story remained a testament to what ordinary people can accomplish when courage, intelligence, and persistence come together. Because in the end, the Mustang did not win the war by being faster, stronger, or deadlier. It won because it could be there, and because thousands of men and women made sure it was. That was its legacy. That was its triumph. And that is why, even today, when a Merlin engine starts and its note climbs into the sky, people still look up.